was in a place of spiritual apathy, a vaguely unhappy but lazy agnostic. I was doing my usual reporter thing. He then followed up via email, and we got into this extended email exchange that turned into a venue in which I found myself asking questions focused mainly on the historical claims of the Gospels and the life of Jesus and the resurrection. I mean, I just found myself obsessively reading about it with an increasing feeling of excitement. Could it be that actually there are books out there that might make it possible for me to suspend my disbelief in this story? I just found myself wanting to continue visiting this church, even though it was totally contrary to how I thought of myself. I felt like I was caught in like the tractor beam of the Death Star or something.
Today, in 2024, who is Jesus to you?
Oh man, that is such an evangelical question.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. We're in a series called The Way Back. Is there a way back to Christian faith in our post-Christian moment? We happen to think so, and somebody else who thinks so is Molly Worthen. Molly is a journalist and associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina. She is a regular contributor to publications like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, and she's a recent adult convert to Christianity who has found faith in the last place that she expected, a Southern Baptist megachurch. Molly, it's so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Give me a picture of who Molly Worthen is. I'm going to pick an age completely at random, age 17, growing up, and I want you to paint a picture for us. Who is Molly Worthen, age 17? What is home life like? What is school life like? And I'm going to tack on the extra spiritual question at the end. If somebody asked you who Jesus was, age 17, what would you say? But first of all, paint the picture about Molly.
Gosh, that's a great way to start. Well, Molly at age 17 was, I suppose, a high school senior in a medium-sized suburb of Chicago, about 20 miles west of the city, called Glen Ellen, Illinois. I was totally focused on the academic and extracurricular tasks immediately in front of me. I wasn't even particularly anxious about getting into university until I really had to be. I was just totally enamored with forensics speech team. Not debate, but rather I did events. So it's almost like track for your mouth.
Wow.
Where I would
you
have to construct an argument and perform it at in front of judges, this sort of thing, and I loved that. And I was really a passionate student of history and literature. I was a big nerd.
And were your parents instilling this in you? Like, what kind of household was your household?
My parents were totally supportive, but they put no pressure on me. I don't really know where it came from. And I suppose I forgot to address the Jesus question. If someone had asked me, in high school, I had no interest in religion. I grew up 2 miles. My house was 2 miles from Wheaton College, which is one of the most prominent evangelical colleges in the United States. And I was kind of dimly aware of it as that strange school where students weren't allowed to dance or something like that. But I really I couldn't have told you what an evangelical was. I had been coerced into going to the local Presbyterian church once as a young child because our very lovely Presbyterian neighbors kept inviting us, and I think my parents acquiesced this one time to be polite. And I remember really resenting it for no good reason. I'm sure it was a very sweet service. So if anything, I had a sort of vague and unfounded animosity toward religion and no real interest in it.
Okay. And the person of Jesus himself, like if somebody kind of nailed your color, if you were to nail your colors to the mast on, like, who was he to you? Would that even register as a question?
When I was 17, I suppose I would have had enough awareness to say he's the center of this religion, and my family puts up a tree and exchanges presents on this day associated with his birth. But I don't believe that until I got to university, I gave really more than 5 minutes thought to the question of Jesus or the claims of Christianity.
Yeah. So tell me, what did you study at university, at college?
Thanks for translating that into American
We're
English.
both contextualizing for each other.
Yeah. I started out with a kind of great books program. I fell in love with Russian language and history. For a good portion of my time at university, I was a religious studies major, although ultimately I graduated with a history major. And I took quite a lot of classes in theology and American history as well as Russian history. So it's been all over the place, but very much in the humanities.
Yes. So, you're a professor of history now. What is it about history that so has gripped you?
I think I fell in love with the endeavor of trying to get as close as possible as we can, using the evidence available, to the worldview and experience of humans who lived in very different times and places. It's the same reason I'm a journalist. I really love trying to, respecting the fact that ultimately there is a sort of asymptote we can't pass between our own experience and that of any other human being. I just love the project of trying to get as close as possible to that understanding. And, you can't fall in love with history in the abstract. You have to have a specific way into it. And for me, it happened to be a course on Russian history. And I'm not sure I could have articulated at the time what I found so compelling about Russian history. It probably resonated with some reading I had already done in Russian literature. I'd been exposed to Dostoevsky in high school. And I think I became entranced by the little bits and pieces I was getting of Orthodox Christianity. It was just so different from, the kind of half-baked ideas I had, which were very much rooted in Western conceptions of spirituality, faith and reason, the human person. And I went to a college that had many pots of money available to undergraduates to do kind of interesting things for the summer. And I had a professor who told me about this somewhat obscure Russian sect called the Old Believers, who broke away from the main body of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 17th century. And, they were persecuted first by the czars and then by the communists. There's a diaspora all over the world now, really. But there was this little community of them that had settled kind of in the middle of nowhere in northern Alberta and Canada. And I became really fascinated by the idea of this community, and I applied for some money and ended up spending the summer living quite close to that community. I couldn't live with them because of rules they have regarding purity and boundaries. However, I became friends with girls my age and eventually won enough trust to participate in things like chicken slaughtering. And I went to their really marathon, pre-dawn church services, and that was a deep dive, my first deep dive into the world of people very different from myself, who also had, they knew what they were about. Not that they didn't have plenty of tensions, and every community does, but it was really powerful, I think, to be in contact with a worldview that, at least from the perspective of a naive 20-year-old, however old I was, seemed just seamless and confident in the way that my, sort of fragmented and not particularly self-reflective secularism wasn't. I think part of me was envious.
Yes. So you didn't feel like you dodged a bullet because you weren't a person of faith. You felt like they hit the jackpot in one sense. Was there something in you that absolutely envied them, but you also did not feel like you were constitutionally able to be a person of faith? Would that be fair to say? That's
exactly right. In college, it wasn't just the Old Believers. I mean, I was meeting for the first time, really. I was having serious conversations with people in a range of religious communities, various very serious Jewish friends, Greek Orthodox, Catholic, and I found myself very jealous of their answers to life's big questions, as well as their sense of community. But I felt I wasn't wired in a way that gave me access. I'd made some very half-baked attempts to go to the local Greek Orthodox church, but it was maybe typical of a kind of immigrant Greek Orthodox congregation in that it was not very accessible to outsiders. They didn't post their service times, things like that. I was too afraid, but I was really envious, and I think that much of my studies from that point on were really about. And I was always self-aware. This is not only an insight I'm having in retrospect. They were a way of sidling up alongside this way of being in the world that I felt like I couldn't do myself, but I admired.
Right, yeah. You're glad that it existed in the world, but you couldn't place yourself into those shoes. You became very interested in a historical sense in religion in North America in particular. How did that come about?
I was interested in religion in all kinds of contexts. I mean, from an intellectual perspective, I would have been really happy specializing in medieval history, but I also wanted to be a journalist, and it's not very easy to sell magazine and newspaper articles to editors about 14th century Carthusians, right? So at some level, I was being pragmatic. And two, I think I had a kind of natural tropism toward the history of ideas. And so maybe that meant that it never occurred to me that I could study, the 20th century without going way, way back and tracing the roots of all these things and getting to learn about all that older history and that broader, global story, even if my focus was on the American context, because I needed to have some kind of expertise that secular editors would consider relevant. So when I went into my graduate program, I mean, I had this kind of funny back knowledge of orthodoxy, but I didn't really know much at all about American evangelicalism, my purported focal point.
And what are the sorts of things that we would discover if we did a search for the bylines of Molly Worthen in terms of the publications that you've written for, in the New York Times and the New Yorker and that sort of thing, and in terms of the books that you've published? What kind of areas have you written about?
I have written pretty broadly on contemporary American religion and politics. I write a lot about culture wars dynamics with a focal point on American evangelicalism in particular, but sometimes I stray out of that zone. There's the odd article on topics that just caught my interest, like the history of socialized medicine in North America and why it is that the United States has gone on this rather idiosyncratic track compared to the UK and Canada and peer countries. My first book is not on any of this stuff. It's a biography of a man who had a long career in the Foreign Service and high levels of the State Department, posted all over the world before coming to teach at Yale, which is where I met him as an undergraduate. And he had this tremendous archive that he let me look through. So that's really diplomatic history. My last book is a history of American evangelical intellectual life since World War II. It's sort of about the theological infighting that helps explain why it is that despite the quite remarkable diversity of conservative evangelicalism in the United States, there's one fairly narrow strand that's come to be its public face. Why is that? And so that, gave me a chance to really learn the landscape of this world that now apparently I am in as a participant observer or something.
And what would you have said? Let's say you go on vacation to the United Kingdom and you're not yet a Christian, and somebody just says to you, "Oh, American evangelicals. What is the story with American evangelicals? Who are they? Are they a voting bloc? Are they a spiritual movement? Like, how are you going to start to help people from outside the United States to get their hands on this subject of U.S. evangelicalism?"
And you're asking how would I have attempted to do that before
and after, and
Christian?
maybe there's no great change, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, a part of why I was attracted to the study of American evangelical politics and history is because even before I knew much of anything about evangelicalism, I had this sense that the mainstream media treatment of American evangelicals was somewhat superficial and black and white in a way that didn't do justice to the complexity. I suppose I feel that about the media coverage of most human communities, although I actually think that coverage of American religion is pretty good, at least in certain publications today. So, gosh, I think my impulse, for better and for worse, has always been to take the ideas of human communities very seriously. Maybe I take them too seriously. So while it's impossible to talk about evangelicals or any group of people without paying a lot of attention to socioeconomic class and race and gender and all of these things, I think I have a tendency to say to somebody trying to understand a community from the outside, pay attention to what these people say they believe until you have a reason to know that, they're operating in bad faith or they're on a campaign to fool themselves and other people. Give any human community the benefit of the doubt and really investigate what they're saying about the world. So I guess that kind of advice and caveat, that's framed how I try to write about really any group I write about.
Where do you get that kind of open-mindedness? Because it's rare as hen's teeth in a social media age where we are all tribalized and where we all do nitpicking. Nitpicking is taking issue with something very small. Nitpicking is choosing the nuttiest example of your opponent's worldview and saying that is representative of the whole. And we're very good at nitpicking just naturally, and we're being trained in nitpicking in a social media age. But what you're describing there is very, very open-minded. Where do you get that from?
Oh, that's interesting. That's very nice of you to put it that way. I hadn't really thought of it as, I like to think I'm open-minded, but I think of it as much as my focus on ideas. It can also be a handicap. I think it has made me put sometimes too much confidence in the internal consistency of people's worldviews, including my own, maybe, in a way that's actually not how humans operate. I don't know where my tendency to treat people as floating brains came from, but it's as much of a problem as it is a good thing. I suppose it is, though. Maybe why it strikes you as open-minded is because it's an asset if you're trying to do reporting and you're trying to get people in a community that you're not a part of to trust you, because it means that your MO has to be do my homework, read as much of what you have published or said, put out into the world about what you believe before I approach you, learn your history, and then ask you to sit down with me to answer questions about your ideas. And I think generally people from any background like to have that kind of conversation. And maybe it's not, especially in our current moment when everyone has a sense of what tribe they're in and what team they're on. That's a conversation that we're invited to have less and less. So it's really fun to have that. I think I'm trying to kind of bring that. I'm working with colleagues in my own university to try to bring that emphasis back into our classrooms to the extent that it's been missing a little bit. So that I guess is the frame of my curiosity, but it's not to say that it doesn't have its blind spots.
Sure. But it is, there's the curiosity, there's the empathy, there's the wanting to understand a worldview from the inside, and there's that finding a point of common connection. Which are wonderful traits of a journalist, but wonderful traits in terms of building community as well. So with all that, you first show up at the Summit Church in North Carolina. What took you to the church where you now are for the first time?
Okay, well, so in terms of my personal spirit, I was not there for personal spiritual reasons. That's for sure. I had made a half-baked, very earnest, but unsuccessful attempt to get myself churched in graduate school in the context of a high Anglo-Catholic Episcopalian parish. But that just, I don't know, it didn't take. I don't know the right way to put it. I had gone through a few phases since then of attending church, always like very true to your caricature, right, of the kind of snobby East Coast professor, always in a very high church context. I had very strong opinions on liturgy, even if I couldn't decide what I thought about the existence of God, let alone Jesus. I had very strong opinions about, what sort of outfits the priest should wear and what was respectable and what was just not. But by the time we're talking about, the time I found my way to that church in Raleigh, North Carolina, I was in a place of spiritual apathy generally. I mean, I was sort of a vaguely unhappy but lazy agnostic who thought that eventually, like, surely I wouldn't be an agnostic for my whole life. Just didn't seem tenable. Surely eventually I would get my act together and I would become Catholic or some variety of Anglican or maybe Orthodox, go back to my seeker roots. But I was not doing anything about it. I would have, and still do, describe my sort of epistemology as pragmatist in the William James sense. He's been a hero of mine for many years. This is the early 20th century American philosopher, part of the famous literary James family, he was one of the pioneers of modern psychology, and not a person of traditional faith himself, but very, very open, considered himself very, very open to the whole range of human, metaphysical, supernatural claims. And his feeling was we have to constantly be aware of the limits of our own access to reality and hold our own truth claims very provisionally and be continually open to revising our theory of the world based on new evidence. And that sounds lovely, and of course it's not how we're wired, by evolution or whatever, right? We're wired with our bias toward confirmation of our existing prejudices and all these things. But in terms of something to aspire to, I really liked William James. I was continuing to do journalism alongside my ordinary professor work here at the University of North Carolina. So I was working on a magazine article, this is in the spring of 2022, about this local megachurch that I had been aware of for my whole time teaching at UNC because they've got a big presence on our campus among our students. They're a giant growing church. Their pastor had recently stepped down from his term as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So I thought, this would make, this is a good chance to get to know this church and talk about megachurches and also fold it into a broader look at the politics of the Southern Baptist world. So I was doing my usual reporter thing. I had a number of conversations with people who attended the church, staff members. I was learning, more and more about the, intricate dynamics of Southern Baptist controversies as they stood in 2022. And was increasingly aware that this church, even by the standards of the Southern Baptist Convention, was really obsessed with evangelism. I mean, Southern Baptists are pretty serious evangelists in general, but this church has sent out more missionaries internationally than any other church in the SBC, I mean, every year for the past 10 years or something. And they have planted more than 500 new churches in the United States and abroad. And just every person I talked to who was associated with the church was just so single-mindedly focused on evangelism. It made a big impression on me. So those were sort of the things on my mind as I went into the pivotal conversation, I suppose, which was the conversation I had with the pastor, whose name is J.D. Greer.
Yeah, and so not exactly a high liturgical church with bells and smells and incense. I'm imagining rock band and T-shirts and ripped jeans and that sort of thing.
Yes, maybe not ripped jeans,
okay.
but yes, Baptist,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
I mean, they're the platonic, whatever your cliche is of a suburban megachurch. That's accurate. Although they don't have a coffee shop in the lobby. That's the one piece of the parody that they don't have, I would say.
So you left after the first Sunday and you thought, perhaps I have enough to go away and write my article, or but what was it that kept you coming back?
Well, I went to services at the main. It's one of these mega churches where there's like the mothership, the main campus that then broadcasts the sermon to all these other campuses. So I went to the mothership once. I went to one of the satellite campuses. But the key thing that happened was that I met the pastor, and that interview was maybe a little bit longer than normal. He was a better listener than a lot of these guys are. I mean, I should say I have a fair amount of experience interviewing kind of evangelical warlord types, like these guys who very conservative theology, and they've built some sort of empire, and they're always like very courteous to someone like me, but not that interested in, I suppose, really having a two-way conversation, which is fine. I mean, I'm usually there as a journalist, but there was a little bit more back and forth in this conversation I had with JD, and it came out. I mean, I don't go out of my way to conceal my own views. I never have done that. I mean, it's always been my practice when someone I was interviewing asked me about my own faith, I would just say, I'm not a Christian. I'm open to it. I'm envious. Sometimes I would even say I'm envious of it. But that I found myself volunteering maybe a little bit more about my own views than was typical. And he then followed up via email, and we got into this extended email exchange that turned into a venue in which I found myself asking questions focused mainly on the historical claims of the Gospels and the life of Jesus and the resurrection. Questions that, I hadn't been, it's not like I'd been wrestling with these questions in a self-conscious way. Clearly they were there, like just below the surface. I had questions about, how the Christian claims stack up alongside the claims that Mormons make about Joseph Smith or Muslims make about the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, all the basic questions, right, that I'm sure he'd heard loads of times. But he took the questions with sort of shocking seriousness. I mean, he would write me back these really long, well-researched, often footnoted answers. Sometimes he would say, I would fire off some half-baked question. I mean, I wasn't well-read in this stuff. And he would say, that's a really good question. Let me ask some colleagues and look at some books and get back to you. So he gave me the feeling of taking my questions very seriously. And as this conversation was unfolding, I just found myself wanting to continue visiting this church, even though it was totally contrary to how I thought of myself. I felt like I was caught in like the tractor beam of the Death Star or something. I mean, I'd always, if I'm honest, even though I had certainly made fun of megachurch worship in the past, at some level I'd always secretly liked it. I mean, I don't think it's hard. It's hard to go to a megachurch worship service when the band is rocking out, like the room is thumping, it's dark, and that music is like it's the same syncopation, and often the arrangements are similar to the music that does well in the mainstream pop music world, right? Like it's
Coldplay and a TED Talk, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not ashamed any longer. I once was. I'm not ashamed to admit that I get affected by it. And the preaching was really good. Was JD and his colleagues, because there's a number of pastors on staff, they're not like, it's not like so erudite that it alienates people, but rarely a sermon would go by, and these are Reformed Baptist sermons, right? So we're talking like 45 minutes. It's a great lecture. Rarely a lecture would go by without quotations of and explication of Greek terms, and I felt like I was really learning stuff. It was interesting. And this is, I'm continuing to go as I'm continuing to kind of have these conversations with this pastor. And at a certain point I said to him, I'm an academic. I like to learn about things by just reading the best stuff on the topic. Can you just give me some homework? And so he recommended that I read some books. We were focused on the resurrection, and there were a number of books that were important, but the central one that he recommended was N.T. Wright's giant book on the Resurrection and the Son of God.
Okay, so you like a challenge.
So I can tell you. Yeah, well, I just found myself. So this is the summer of 2022. I mean, it was akin to doing a master's thesis or something. I mean, I just found myself obsessively reading about it with an increasing feeling of excitement. Like, could it be that actually there are books out there that might make it possible for me to suspend my disbelief in this story? And I'm not someone who keeps a journal generally. I don't find my interior life that interesting, but I found I had no choice but to start keeping a diary, recording my reading and my kind of grudging reactions to it. The key about this for me, because again, I thought of myself as someone who had investigated Christianity, who had sincerely attempted to become a Christian, who was much more open, I thought, than the usual secular person to the claims of Christianity. But I think in the past, I had been overwhelmed by all of the dimensions of the Christian worldview that are so, if you're not a Christian, so bananas, right? And this is true anytime you're looking at any religious worldview, I suppose. There's just a lot that is at odds with our 21st century kind of post-Enlightenment empiricist or attempting to be empiricist worldview. So it's not just Jesus, it's all the miracle claims in the Bible. It's the end times, heaven and hell, the ethic of sexuality that's totally at odds with mainstream secular ideas. It's paralyzing. It's like, where do I even start? And if I begin to tug on this strand, I quickly get distracted by these other crazy things, and then I'm back to square one, and I think, how can I even take any of this seriously? What my conversations with JD and the reading I should say Tim Keller also, JD put me in touch with Tim Keller, what they put me onto was this very specific question of whether the Christian claims about what happened at Jesus's tomb are true. And I, as a historian, I was immediately attracted to that because it's a historical question. And when I saw that really everything stands or falls on the resurrection, and that I can agree to kind of struggle with all the other questions, I can put those aside for now. They're important, but they're not the main thing. The main thing is the resurrection.
How did you come to that? Because so few people kind of choose that as the centerpiece. I think it's absolutely the centerpiece if you want to investigate the faith. So clearly J.D. Greer is saying that, Tim Keller is saying that, or you somehow knew that the resurrection was the thing to aim all your skeptical guns at?
In retrospect, I mean, I'm ashamed of myself that I never seriously investigated it earlier. I was doing a fancy PhD. I mean, not in New Testament studies, but Christian history, for crying out loud. Like, why didn't it occur to me to look at this more seriously? And I mean, it's not like I was a bozo about Christian doctrine. I mean, I knew the centrality of the resurrection. I don't think I had quite, I'd quite focused on it though. I mean, I have to give a lot of credit to both to JD and to Tim. I mean, I think they saw that that they were dealing with a historian who was, kind of nerdy and would be interested in this stuff as a historian, like even if it didn't work evangelistically. But somehow these questions were already they were percolating in a kind of subterranean way, I have to grant. I mean, what? The Christian answer is clearly like it's the Holy Spirit. I mean, I felt very like we're all very idiosyncratic humans, and God made like a very idiosyncratic path for me. And these questions were there, and I simply I'd never asked them. I mean, it's funny to say this, but as this email correspondence was developing, and I was doing this reading, I would meet with JD roughly once a month to sort of check in. It quickly occurred to me that I had never been evangelized before. I mean, I've spent many years reporting, among evangelicals, and they would occasionally say, I'll pray for you. And I know plenty of serious Christians, although at the time not closely, but no one had really seriously evangelized me. And I think a lot of that is because evangelism is deeply unfashionable. I mean, it's in our pluralistic, you do you culture. It's incredibly offensive. And, I understand why our pluralistic society depends on a certain cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, if you or, a devout Muslim or a devout Jewish person, has an exclusive truth claim, our peace and harmony depends on you kind of keeping your exclusive truth claim to yourself and not telling me to my face, right, that I am not living how God wants me to live and that I may be on my way to damnation. Evangelism is outrageous, but I mean, I think it's so important, and if it happens in the context of relationships. So I mean, crucially, I developed this like very surprising friendship with this Southern Baptist megachurch pastor that you would never expect us to be friends. And so we could be having like on the, 1 minute, like a super sincere conversation about, the discrepancies among the gospels or whatever. And then the next moment we could be making fun of each other, kind of teasing each other based on, the stereotypes. I mean, he drives like a giant pickup truck and I drive a Prius. Like we stereotypes are stereotypes because they have a grain of truth. So I think that the evangelism was possible because of the friendship and because of like the commitment to caring about the other person, regardless of where this conversation goes.
Yeah, that's a great word about the importance of evangelism and the rarity of evangelism in the church today. But there are different kinds of evangelists, aren't there? So help us to compare and contrast J.D. Greer and Tim Keller. How would you compare and contrast them as evangelists and in this task of evangelism?
They were the perfect team for me. They were. I really think that God looked at his roster. And he was like, this, it can't, neither of these guys by himself could do it, but together they can do it. I mean, Tim, I really miss him. I didn't get to know him well, but we had a few conversations over Zoom and extended email correspondence. And then of course I was so many people, I was so shaped by his books and sermons online. He made it seem possible to a cerebral Yankee secular person who had no personal connections to any religious community in an organic way. He made it seem possible for someone like me to find a way into that world. And in our conversations, he was so relaxed and he never put any pressure on me, and he made me feel like all my doubts and questions were totally normal, and that even he as a mature Christian shared them. And that was a powerful contrast to what I would describe as the Southern Baptist relentlessness of JD. Mm-hmm. I mean, just like a bloodhound, not in a way that, I mean, he knew when to pull back and kind of give me space. And that it couldn't, I had to be coming to him with questions. It couldn't go only in one direction. But I think I needed both.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my first conversation with Tim Keller. I told him my story, and he leaned back in his chair, and he was suffering from cancer at the time, but still just totally, he didn't want to talk about that at all. He only wanted to talk about my situation. He said, "I don't know, Molly, maybe you'll become a Christian this time, or maybe you'll just stall out again. I don't know." And I was a little bit thrown, right? Because I'd been dealing with, this Baptist who was just on me. Like every other conversation would end in an altar call, and here Tim Keller is telling me I might stall out, and he seems like sort of indifferent.
Where I think that might be so vital for you is that if you are just reading Tom Wright's Resurrection and the Son of Gods, there might be the sense that, I'm going deep into the issue of the historical resurrection, but to what end? But if you've got a J.D. Greer who's after you, it's very clear to what end. You're doing your homework, not for the sake of having a greater appreciation of this culture. You're doing your homework because you need to meet Jesus.
And the point that a number of people made to me, probably J.D. and Tim both made this point to me in some conversation. I remember hearing it from a Jesuit acquaintance in Toronto. It's I think a very familiar Christian point. I was seeking some kind of affirmation through experience. I mean, here I am reading all these books, taking all these notes, and having my presuppositions disturbed in some significant ways. But I thought, man, at the end of the day, I can't become a Christian just by reading a lot of footnotes. I mean, surely at some point, maybe I'm not going to get the apparition of Jesus like at the foot of my bed, but surely at least I can get, like a warm and fuzzy feel. I just want a warm and fuzzy feeling. That's all. Something. And so I was doing all this stuff, right? I was going to church, I was praying, reading scripture. I was my relationship to the Bible was changing. That was a very serious thing that I can categorize as an experience. But in general, it felt so cerebral. And I would complain about this to Christians, and they would say, it sounds like what you are asking for is the relationship of faith. And it's like any relationship. It's like a friendship. You can kind of suss out the person at a polite distance. You can check their references, ask around. You can do all your homework. But if you want the experience of the relationship, you have to take the plunge. You have to actually enter the relationship and put some trust in it, put yourself at risk. And I found that persuasive. And so it made me accept, and I also remember a conversation that I had with JD where I was complaining about my lack of spiritual experience. And he said, you just have to take what God gives you. Like, God makes people in different ways. He didn't make you Pentecostal. Mm-hmm, so deal with it, essentially. And so I realized that if I was willing to suspend my disbelief in the supernatural, which truly is the hard, that was the huge barrier for me. But if I was willing to do that, then I had to grant that while, I didn't find myself 100% persuaded by N.T. Wright's assessment of the evidence, or Richard Bauckham, or any of these guys, that Jesus truly rose from the dead, I had to grant that the secular alternatives were really not as persuasive, and I was certainly north of 51% persuaded. And if I was truly a William James style pragmatist, willing to adjust my working theory of the universe based on new evidence, then I had to submit to this.
Yes. Yeah, there's that sense of, am I able to take the leap of faith forwards towards Jesus? Well, that's one question, but there's another question, like, can I go back to a materialist view of the world? And with all that I know now, I think when God sort of shuts that door behind you, there's a very significant nudge towards taking the leap. We on this channel, we've had Tom Holland come on many times, talking about doing a history of the church and kind of the fruits of Christian civilization. have led to the secular liberal values that we all take for granted. And I think he has given a lot of people a vocabulary for faith that they didn't think they had. They thought they were incapable of believing. They thought they were incapable of having any sense of the supernatural or the transcendent. And he starts pointing out, well, where do you think your human rights come from? It's as theological as believing that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of the Father. And a lot of people I found have taken sort of a Tom Holland train, but they've taken it so far to the point where they're kind of almost even sold on the moral fruits of Christendom, and that Jesus is at the heart of the beliefs they already have, but they can't sign up to the metaphysics. And I know people who sort of describe themselves like Nick Cave, the Australian rock star, who says, he is religious but not spiritual. Very, very happy actually to submit to the Christian story, but he hasn't had this encounter, and he doesn't know if he'll ever have that encounter. What would you say to people who are in a situation like that? How can they come to faith for themselves?
Yeah, that was definitely me. That you've just described most of the people in my world, and I've thought a lot about this. And I love Tom Holland's book Dominion. I think he crystallized in a super powerful, zesty, compelling narrative way. I mean, really the central questions that historians have been wrestling with for the past generation, and that are a big part of my own kind of disillusionment with secular liberalism's ability to answer those questions about the sources of universal human rights. I think my advice would be that most people in this category who say, I can buy the argument that there needs to be some kind of metaphysical basis to my picture of what a human person is and what that person deserves, but I can't really buy it because my whole day-to-day experience is that of a closed universe in which the natural laws are impermeable and anything else is the fruit of imagination. Most of these people consider themselves very cosmopolitan, very open to other worldviews, very aware of the legacy of European colonialism and the sort of immoral tyrannies, political and intellectual, that have come with that history. And so I guess I think if that's true, then isn't the next logical step to start taking the worldviews of the vast majority of humans alive today, let alone humans who've lived throughout the history of our species, seriously? For me, this took the form of, it immediately followed my baptism. So it wasn't part of my conversion proper, but I would say it was tremendously important for me intellectually. And that was research I did on claims regarding miraculous healings, both in the United States and around the world. And as I started reading the pretty vast literature, some of which is quite excellent, collecting these stories, attempting to, in some cases, investigate them to the extent that there's documentation, and sometimes there is. Sometimes it's awfully interesting. Having conversations both with academics who were familiar with my frame, and also with people who may now kind of reside in Western academia, but come from countries where there is more common experience with the supernatural. The scales kind of fell from my eyes. I mean, I realized how blinkered I had been, how I had just tuned out and never investigated this huge swath of human experience. And sure, you can write off some proportion of claims to miraculous healing as wishful thinking or hallucination or whatever. But we're talking about millions of people we're talking about like 90% of the people who become Christian in places like Burma say that they become Christian out of personal experience with a healing claim. I mean, this is what scholars like Craig Keener have found. And then, you do, if you really investigate this stuff, you find cases where there is enough documentation to suggest that something awfully weird happened. Now, none of this proves causality, right? And I've had, in my research, I always investigate multiple sides. So I certainly had fruitful conversations with materialist skeptics who can always say, oh, all right, we cannot explain why that woman regained her sight after many years, directly after prayer. However, science is advancing, and at some point, science will produce an answer. Well, that's fine. That's as unfalsifiable as the Pentecostal saying that that healing was the result of the Holy Spirit's intervention, right? And so, if investigating these supernatural claims that come from this huge swath of human experience doesn't immediately give you faith that it's all true, at the very least, it might disturb your materialist presuppositions just enough to allow you to suspend disbelief in the supernatural. So that, I think, I think that's a fruitful line of inquiry for any person who wants Christianity to be true but can't quite get there with the metaphysics, because the desire does have to come first. I do think that this kind of turn we've seen in apologetics to recognize that you can't just lead by snowing somebody with natural theology and doctrinal claims. You've got to work with them to maybe see why they ought to be less satisfied than they think they are with their current worldview. You've got to work with them to see past maybe bad experiences they perhaps have had with Christians who don't behave in a way very consistent with the Gospels. You have to get them to the point where they want Christianity to be true before they can be open to any of this evidence.
Right. Yeah, the whole Pascal thing. Yeah, make people of goodwill wish it were true, and then show them that it is. And I found it quite fruitful more recently to think, if you are on the Tom Holland train and have come to see that, morally speaking, we've been living off a Christian inheritance, and we have considered that certain moral claims are self-evident, self-directed, impersonal, just there by themselves. And if you've come to see that that's nonsense, there is a parallel in the metaphysical world, that a post-Christian society that has developed the Western scientific method also, strangely enough, thinks that the universe kind of continues on in a self-directed, closed system that's entirely impersonal and requires, nothing personal about it. But if you're starting to see that it is unlikely that the moral system is as self-sufficient as you think it is, then maybe the metaphysical system isn't as self-sufficient as you think it is either. I think there's an interesting parallel there, I think, that's worth pressing into. And as you say, like if one of those miracle claims is true, then naturalism is false. like literally, if
right.
One of those.
Right. And I will say, I was talking only about all the scholarship on the resurrection, but I did a lot of reading in cosmology. I was kind of working on two tracks at once, investigating these claims about the resurrection, but also, I was not even a confident theist, so I had to investigate that also. And the recent work in that area, the various cosmological constants, the fine tuning of the universe, the things that physicists have learned recently that have started to make the alternatives to theism seem just as theological, crazier. The multiverse stuff,
right?
At least as crazy as any religious
completely
scheme.
Untestable. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that also is a really fruitful line of reading. And then, the kind of problem of consciousness in Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, in which he confesses that while he's not he hasn't gotten himself to the position of any traditional religion. That book is all about his disillusionment with naturalistic.
Why naturalism is almost certainly false. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, as a subtitle. That's a heck of a subtitle. Do you have time for one last question, Molly? Is that okay?
Of course.
Great. Because we started with the question, age 17, we asked 17-year-old Molly, who is Jesus? So it's been also recent for you. We're just going back to 2022, aren't we? In terms of pulling at this thread and finding Jesus on the other end of it. Tell me, today in 2024, who is Jesus to you?
Oh man, that is such an evangelical question. Well, listen, I don't think I fit in the narrative of that question assumes very well, because my process was to accept on the evidence this thing that happened in history, and then to say, okay, if I'm going to accept that happened, I've got to assimilate all this other stuff. So I am still, I can tell you, right? I can tell you that Jesus is Lord. I can use all the the evangelical ease. But the fact of the matter is that I am still every day working really hard to actually wrap my head around all that follows from the resurrection. I think maybe, if you've been a Christian a long time or you've grown up in it, you're used to reciting the creed, saying these things. You forget how crazy they are. The idea that God is a personal God, that God cares about you and me as individuals. What an insane thing. What an outrageously hubristic, right? If we take it out of theological context, it's outrageous. This idea that Jesus, I can almost go with you to wrap my head around the idea that Jesus died for the sins of the human race. Okay, that seems like something the Son of God would do. But you're telling me that he died for my sins? I want to say that Jesus is my Lord, yes, but he's also he's someone like I am actively trying to develop this thing that Christians talk about as a relationship with Jesus. That is not something that I gained upon, praying my ham-fisted version of the sinner's prayer, or upon being, dunked in the jacuzzi-sized tank on stage at my megachurch. That's something that I'm still slowly feeling my way into. This notion that God is not an abstraction, but a person who we should love. I'm doing my best in the way that comes naturally to me, which is to read a lot of books, but that only gets you so far, So the other pieces of it, the praying, the encountering God in Scripture, that takes a lot of practice. It's not something that I have found comes naturally at all, and so that is my. I don't know. that is my perhaps evasive answer to your question, who is Jesus? I don't know yet. I hope.
Yeah.
I hope one day I have the visceral sense of who he is that you have, or that people who are not spiritual infants like I am have, but I don't have it yet.
Yeah, I didn't want the cliche. Yeah, and I knew you wouldn't give me a cliche, because if you gave me a cliche, that would be a lousy end to the interview. There's that immense sense, like the whole Bible. You've had 66 books that are all about Jesus, and then Revelation comes along, and like one of the last sights we have of Jesus is Revelation chapter 19, and he's riding on a white horse, and he's got a tattoo down his leg that is, Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and he has a name that no one knows but he himself. And at the end of Scripture, it's not like, okay, and now we've got Jesus sewn up. Now we've got Jesus in a box. It's not I can refer you back to the previous 65 books and you now have Jesus nailed. He has a name written on himself that no one knows but he himself. He is the most deeply mysterious person in the universe. And that's what makes him the most fascinating person in the universe. And that's what makes him the center of faith. And that's why the resurrection is so vital, because it's not just a supernatural event happened, I guess naturalism is false. It's this guy is the heavyweight champion over death. And it was the case that death was Lord because death had never lost a battle. And now this guy has beaten death, and so this guy is Lord, and the future belongs to this guy. And we spend all eternity kind of figuring out who this guy is. But yeah, perish the thought that coming to know him would be a cliche. I think you pointed beautifully to. Yeah.
I have to tell you that part of my process of coming to believe that I could trust the Bible's claims about Jesus was wrapped up in coming to appreciate how weird Jesus is and how weird the stuff he says is. I mean, Matthew 11:28, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I mean, the gentle and lowly in heart, yoke stuff. Like, what is he talking about? The healing miracles, his different method for all these different people. Sometimes he's spitting on his fingers and rubbing dirt in their eyes. And
curses a fig tree, for goodness sakes.
It has, and this was C.S. Lewis's point, right? Like, Lewis is like, I've read all the mythology. I know what that looks like. This is different. This is an account of stuff that happened that people saw, and they were like, what the heck? We need to write this down. And I came to have that reaction to it myself.
Yeah. And the final of the four Gospels finishes with John saying, if everything was written about Jesus, not even all the books in the world would have enough space to, there's deep mystery to it, and we must never reduce that. Molly Worthen, it's been so great spending time with you. So, how can people catch up with you? And you're working on a book at the moment. Is there a way that people can find either what you've written in the past or what you're about to come out with?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not on social media at all. I believe it's destroying civilization, but certainly
there is that.
I'm Googleable, and I have an email address at UNC. I'm finishing up a book on the history of charisma as both a religious idea and a political idea, mostly in the American context. I did an Audible course on charismatic leaders in America a couple of years ago, but the book is a bigger, more confusing version that I've learned a lot writing, but that's coming out in early next year. But I always love to hear from people, and one reason I decided to talk about my conversion and tell the internet about something so personal is because it has been really a blessing to hear from such a wide range of Christians, some of whom, a small number of whom are adult converts like me or investigating, but many of whom are not. However, it's been eye-opening to learn how many Christians, even those who grow up in it, wrestle with doubt and can really find common ground with someone like me who's come to it so late.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure your story will resonate with so many people. Molly, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me.